Ich heiße Sie alle herzlich willkommen bei dem heutigen F3-Abend. Mein Name ist Nora Lukacs, ich bin wissenschaftliche Volontärin an der Kunstsammlung Nordrhein-Westfalen und ich werde Sie durch den heutigen Abend begleiten, weil Doris Christoph gerade verreist ist. Unser Gast heute ist die pakistanische Künstlerin Mehreen Murtaza. And I will just give a short introduction about tonight's program in German, and then we will have an artist talk in English. Letzter Zeit wurde wegen unserem langfristigen Forschungsprojekt Museum Global immer wieder Aspekte der globalen Kunstszene hier im Schmälerhaus thematisiert. Aber eigentliches Thema der F3, sprich Futur 3 Abende, ist die Annäherung an eine unbekannte Zukunft. Und bei diesen Abend wurden viele unterschiedliche Zukunftsszenarien thematisiert. Und als ich Mehreen das erste Mal auf den heutigen Abend ansprach, könnte sie sich sofort mit dem Thema Annäherung an eine unbekannte Zukunft identifizieren, denn dies könnte auch das Motto ihrer künstlerischen Arbeit sein. Wie wir das gleich am Beispiel der ersten Installation sehen werden, ihre Fragestellungen bewegen sich an der Schnittstelle von Wissenschaft, angeregt und Science Fiction und Computertechnik, und Spiritualität und Mystik, was auch ihre Wurzeln in der Sufismus, in der Sufi-Kultur hat. Der Anlass, dass sie gerade heute hier bei uns ist und wir über ihre Arbeiten sprechen, ist ein 3-monatiges Arbeitsaufenthalt in Wiesbaden, das sie heute beendet hat und morgen oder übermorgen schon nach Lahore in ihre Heimatstadt zurückfliegen wird. Zu dieser Residency kam es durch ein Stipendium. Das Stipendium heißt Follow Fluxus, die Fluxus und ihre Folgen. Für den Stipendium wurde sie übrigens von Frau Dr. Marion Ackermann vorgeschlagen. Und das Stipendium ermöglichte neben einem relativ langen Deutschlandaufenthalt auch eine Einzelausstellung im Nassauischen Kunstverein Wiesbaden. Und die Ausstellung ist gerade jetzt zu sehen, das heißt How Will You Conduct Yourself in the Company of Trees? Also wie verhalten wir uns in der Gesellschaft von Bäumen? Ich gehe davon aus, dass die Nähe des sommergrünen Laubwaldes in Europa und die Präsenz der Natur im Stadtraum für Mehreen in den letzten 3 Monaten ausschlaggebend war für die neue Arbeit. Für die Ausstellung im Kunstverein verkabelte nämlich die Künstlerin Pflanzen mit Elektrotechnik und Soundequipment, um die Energiezyklen dieser lebenden Organismen dadurch zu verstärken und daraus ein Sound, ein Musizieren oder ein Sprechen zu erzeugen. Vorgestern hat sie gemeinsam mit dem Lichtlabor der Hochschule Rhein-Main auch eine Außeninstallation verwirklicht, wo sie mit Eichenbäumen gearbeitet hat, solange das Kunstlabor einen Nachtregenbogen präsentiert hat, das sie in den letzten Jahren entwickelt haben. Und wie gesagt, der heutige Abend kann auch ebenfalls aus der Perspektive der Museum Global von Interesse sein, weil Mehreen auch darüber berichten kann, wie die junge heute international tätige Kunstszene in Pakistan auf die Künstlergeneration der Moderne blickt und die als eine Vorreiter sieht und wie die jungen Künstler heute fördern, dass die Lebenswerke dieser Künstler aufgearbeitet werden. Das hat bisher noch nicht erfolgt, wurde in den letzten Jahren erst angefangen. Also Sie können gerne auch einige Fragen dazu stellen, vielleicht kann Mehreen sie dann beantworten. Okay, ich werde jetzt noch kurz ihre Biografie vorstellen und dann überlasse ich das Wort Mehreen Murtaza, die 6 Arbeiten präsentieren wird und danach können wir kurz über die Arbeiten sprechen. Also, I will quickly summarize your biography and then we can continue, but I will be faster. So, Mehreen Murtaza wurde 1986 in Riyadh in Saudi-Arabien geboren, kommt eigentlich aus Pakistan, aus Lahore, wo sie heute lebt und arbeitet. Sie hat ihr Studium in 2008 an der Beacon House National University in Fine Arts and in Teaching abgeschlossen mit Auszeichnung. Seitdem hat sie an mehreren Künstlerresidencies teilgenommen, in Deutschland, Holland, Japan und England. Sie hat mehrere Einzelausstellungen gehabt Zum Beispiel in Kalkutta zweimal. In London in 2012 zeigte sie an der Frieser Art Fair das Projekt Transmissions from a Missing Satellite, worüber wir gleich sprechen werden. Und bei der Art Dubai hat sie auch zweimal ihre Werke gezeigt. Sie war präsentiert an zahlreichen internationalen Gruppenausstellungen und Biennalen. Nur um einige davon zu nennen, ist zum Beispiel die 5. Fukuoka Asian Art Triennale, HTML Festival für feministische Internetkunst, der Gruppenschau Contemporary Art and Geopolitics in the Arab World, an der 2. Transnational Pavillon der Venedig Biennale oder die Moskau Biennale für junge Kunst oder die 3. Gwangju Biennale in Nordkorea. Sie wird durch die Galerie Grey Noise in Dubai vertreten und durch Experimente in Kalkutta. Und jetzt können wir über die Arbeiten reden. So we can start to talk about the works.
Okay, great. Is this on?
Yeah, I think it's on.
First of all, thank you for coming, even though it's a very rainy day in Düsseldorf today, and I've just arrived, welcomed by the rain. This is after a very good event we had at the Hochschule Rhein-Main, where we kind of set up actually, it would be better if I show you beforehand what I've done recently, and then we can sort of move backwards. I think I would also not want to talk about what the work is overall as yet, and maybe talk about it once you see the work and kind of make connections with whatever has been happening. I'm not very Windows friendly.
Okay, but I think you can use this one.
Okay, I'm just going to open the PowerPoint first.
Okay, and you can read this too.
Okay, great. So I will start with what I did recently in Wiesbaden. So this is my first time in Wiesbaden. I've come to Germany before. Of course, I was in Berlin for a few days, and I've been passing through back and forth. The way this body of work started was that I had just recently finished a very different narrative, which had a lot of similar ideas, which had to do with a lot of iconography that comes from science fiction. And by science fiction, I'm referring to very specific authors that I've been reading, mostly from the 70s, like Philip K. Dick and William Gibson, who write a lot about contemporary life and urban life. And so a lot of the stuff that came out from those readings eventually fed into my own work. And so with this, my usual way of researching or starting a new body of work is to really get a feel, like it's very, very physical for me. So I like to kind of move around, orient myself around the city and the settings, and then very intuitively pick up objects, rearrange them, and sort of create a connection. So this was the invite for the show, and what you're seeing is a small section, a detail from a larger installation. So these were all objects that I collected from Wiesbaden. Specifically nature. So these were a lot of walks in the forest outside Wiesbaden, a lot of small parks, spent a lot of time around trees. And so a lot of these objects came together as sort of a taxonomy for something that I wanted to develop further. So these are just some very quick images that I've put together, which don't do justice to the process of where we ended up, but just to give you an idea. The image that you're seeing on, yes, I really wanted to use the pointer, is an image of L. Ron Hubbard, who leads the Scientology department. He has an interesting and fascinating story as well, because he used to be a science fiction writer, and eventually this led to the making of Scientology as a religion as we know it now. And so I have been collecting a lot of images, and there was a lot of curiosity as to how a sense of an organized religion, a sense of self and spirituality were coming together with science. So ideally, like, these are three very different disciplines, but that crossover between the two or three was something, or the spaces between these disciplines is what has always interested me. And so this image has sort of stayed with me for a very, very long time, and it sort of came into fruition unconsciously during this process. So once I'd collected all this debris from around Wiesbaden, the idea was to develop something more architectural, more like a tree house that is sort of anthropomorphic. sort of like I termed it as a post-ecological monster of some sorts, like a Frankenstein almost, where you have like man-made objects and nature itself sort of coexisting in a symbiotic relationship. And so the ethos of it was that I sort of set something in motion, which exists already in nature, and then allow it to kind of take over and exist on its own, almost like artificial intelligence. So that was the basic premise of what I was working towards. Once I actually got into the construction of this so-called treehouse, I realized that that idea sort of existed in a realm that once I had kind of come up to it, it seemed like a mere illustration of something that already existed in nature. I was sitting around a lot of trees, and I was very curious to hear what they were saying and almost take literally inspiration from what it would seem authentic to work with, as opposed to picking up something that already exists and reconstructing it. So we basically took, like you can probably see here, we took a voltage meter. So the idea was that everything sort of generates electricity or voltage, and there's energy amongst inanimate objects and also animate objects, was to pick up a current or some kind of a signal, something that we could say is a sense of communication with nature or with the plants or with the trees. So I worked and collaborated with another architect, and we both decided to work in a very different realm, which is sound. I have recently started working with sound, and Tobias Hilke is the person who I worked with, has been doing very commercial architectural projects. So we decided to we were sort of in a space where we decided to do something that we had never done before, which was electronics and sound. And it sort of came together in a very do-it-yourself kind of manner. And I think the excitement of the project came from this sort of open source idea that everything is accessible with even like really basic objects or chemicals that are sitting at home. So we did some really, really funny things. Like you can see, we plugged, so the setup was basically like, for those of you who are familiar with the mechanics, I can give a very basic overview. There's a small kit known as an Arduino kit, which is basically, it's a ready-made kit, and one can program it to do whatever you like to do from it. So what we did was that we took voltage from the trees and the plants and converted that voltage or that data into the most basic form of sound, which is a MIDI signal. And that MIDI signal was then overlaid with different types of filters. And so what you heard was the voltage and basically the sound of the plants, which we then sort of recreated. So these are just images from experiments that we were doing, learning some basic electronics. What is an open circuit? What is a closed circuit? This is an image from the Hochschule Rhein-Main. This was our setup, basically. The two trees that you're seeing over here, like this is the tree that sort of initiated the process. We wanted to name the plants and the trees as well, never got around doing that. But we basically sat here with like open electronics, plugged in everything into the trees. And eventually what came through with that was that we got very excited with what we heard. And so for an indoor setup, basically what you're looking at is an image within the NKV, within the museum. And this is, again, collections from debris and wood parks around Wiesbaden and in Wiesbaden. So there was a lot of raw material to work with, and we kind of orchestrated and created a space indoors, which was, the idea was to experience the essence of the plants, come in and have a conversation with them, basically. So as soon as you enter the space, we had various collections of plants, mostly indoor plants. And this also, the aesthetic also stemmed from a lot of going back and forth to Hornbach and Flanzer Collet, and a lot of like IKEA-looking shops, which had a very specific aesthetic of displaying the plants, naming them, how to take care of them, which was also something completely new for us, because I have always been afraid of gardening, because I've been afraid of killing the plants or taking too much care of them or too little care of them. So it was in a way to overcome our own fears or inhibitions and kind of venture into newer territories. So what you're looking at over here are oyster mushrooms. And so this is a very basic microphone cable. And we have two wires sticking out, one which is grounded into the soil, which is allowing the mycelium, which helps the mushrooms grow. It's connected directly into it. And the other is clipped onto the mushroom. So it was collecting data from both of these, and that was being plugged into the Arduino. So this will give you a better idea, I hope. Well, these are all fresh images, so I have to apologize if they aren't very accurate details that you can see as yet. So this is a very little tiny Arduino kit here. And it has a pins over here that you can kind of plug the cables in. So that's where the oyster mushrooms were that you just saw. And there's a cable that goes all the way into this Arduino kit. And this kit is then connected to a PC or any, basically, CPU. And then that was then connected to speakers. So that's a really, really simple setup. And all the magic was happening here. And that resulted in the sound that was heard in the space. So we made a selection of different plants, which was also very, very intuitive. There were certain ideas that we had about the plants itself, which I feel like now I'm in a good place to develop further. We were looking at the visual aesthetic, like color, tonality, height, the requirements of the plants for an indoor space, and also because the exhibition is open for 6 months. So there was a lot of consideration of the plants. What do they need? What do they require? It was almost as if here we are in your space and in your realm, and we need your permission, or almost we need to introduce or acquaint ourselves with you in order to recreate the space. So we had a lot of cacti, moss. There were a lot of paprika plants and a lot of flowering plants, a lot of vines. The idea was also to kind of make the plants accessible in a way that if you go and you touch the leaf or the stem or even the pot, it will all eventually create some kind of data, which is then converted to sound. So things like, these like plant lights, switching them on, off, humidity, temperature, many elements that go into actually growing the plants were now affecting the sound of the plants as well. So this is the PC setup here, and that's the Arduino kit. That's just another view. And over here we had a simple software which basically showed or illustrated the data that was being picked up. So you could see it as almost like an on-off switch, you could say so. So some of the data that was highlighted green was basically the voltage that it was picking up, and the rest was signals that were in between. So the plants were producing about 20 to 120 millivolts. And because our devices were not that sensitive, it was still able to pick up voltage in between. So it was almost like hearing a conversation, but picking up words within the conversation, and then trying to sort of make sense of it. So there was a very atmospheric sound. It wasn't very precise because there was a lot of data that wasn't collected and missed in the process. But we got a sense or an essence of each plant that was then put into the Arduino to create like an orchestra of plants. So not all of them were connected, but the clips are movable, so you can change. So we clipped the ananas one day, we clipped it onto vines another day, and so you can change the arrangement. So we were also thinking of a band where there is a soloist. So there was the solo, which was the moss, and then the rest sort of become like background noise or sound.
Maybe you have images of the event you did yesterday outside of the museum.
So this was the other smaller room where we had set up speakers. Also, again, a very sort of botanical garden display and a lot of small flora that was collected and objects that were set together. So it was also set in a way that we choreographed the movement of the person through the space as well. That's a Venus flytrap, one of our favorite plants. And here you can see the little clips. So they're very basic crocodile clips that were then connected to the cable over here. Another favorite plant, the roof root, which I wasn't aware of, is a plant that usually grows or people have on their the roof of their homes because it protects it from lightning. So there is a superstitious association with the plant itself, but also because it uses up a lot of sun, it's conducting a lot of electricity in itself and generating it a lot. And so these are some images which we had this event 2 days ago. So we don't have very good images, but just to give you a sense of what was going on there, this is basically the space within the university. And so in a way, like, this is something that I think we were actually really, really looking forward to as well, because we worked with indoor plants earlier. And we wanted to work in a forest, but because of time and resource limitations, we found a space that was conducive for our little experiment. And we connected 5 oak trees within the space, which were very, very conveniently arranged in a beautiful setting for us already. So we set up all our equipment here. And then we used a similar process of connecting the PCs to a very long cable that was grounded to the bark or the ground, and one up on a leaf that was facing the sun. So it was producing and collecting the most data, basically. And so this was when it got a little darker. This is the tent that you saw earlier, and the setup was over here. And so the third person who was involved in this installation was Francisco Scal, who is a light professor over there, and he has been working with an well, I would not say artificial, but a rainbow that can be seen only at night. So that's what you're looking at over here, the rainbow. So people basically came in and they experienced the sound of the 5 trees and the rainbow itself. So it was sort of like a magical evening where you come in and experience all of this. I think the most exciting thing for us in this process was really to see people interact with the trees in a very different way. We had people come in and hug trees just to see how sound changes. And I think it was that relationship that we were experiencing ourselves that was then kind of illustrated. And it was fun to see how people responded in an environment that was not indoors and seemed more natural. And the sound, so I forgot to mention this, the sound was also very, very specific. We chose digital sounds, or a very synthetic sound, you could say, like an analog or digital synthesizer. So what I'll do is, actually, I'll just show you 2 more images, actually. These are bad images, sorry. But I mean, we had some lights, a little setup where each tree was marked with a little laser icon. And so there was things like, I was thinking at least of markings that people leave on trees, usually related to love or their own relationships. And so there was an element where we were aware of the fact that our position is of someone separate from the plants, and almost in a way that we're imposing a personality on them with the sound and with what we're picking. So yeah, I should actually make you listen to the sound, which is the real work. Hear the plants speak. So this is also unedited right now, in the sense that these are very long recordings. We haven't picked out anything from them. I'll start with the oak trees. So what you're hearing right now is that we have, because there were 5 trees, so there were, you could say, 5 band members. We had one main instrument, or one main tree, which was generating like the forefront, the sound in the front, and then there was a background sound, which was the rest of the trees. And we assigned one of the trees with the clicking that you can hear. This was basically recorded from the museum, where we took coins and we dropped them in water, and we took like spaces around us and collected sounds and used that as a filter to pick up the data. So what you would ideally hear, the MIDI sound, is a very basic kind of binary sound, but that's changed to the coin. And then the other sound that you're hearing is sort of like a fluffy wave of synth. And this is the rest of the trees that are producing sound. The recording was made 1/10 of a second. So there is a lot in between that's being missed. So every time, after every 1/10 of a second, there's some voltage that's picked up and immediately generated into a sound. So collectively, this is what you heard. And we had some changes. So it was very easy to identify a pattern if one were to directly plug in one plant or one tree. And so that pattern constantly shifts and changes based on whatever variables are around it. So people would come in and touch the trees or hug them or do something, and the pattern would ever so slightly shift, and then it would kind of go back to what it was. Or you would hear it maybe like a second later or a second after. So there was a lot of experimenting and moving back and forth, and how people were sort of moving around the trees was really, really interesting. And that was sort of the idea that I started with, hence the name of the show was How to Conduct Yourself in the Company of Trees. So this was the outdoor installation. And now I'll play some from recordings that I did indoors at the museum. This is So it might not be very perceptible right now, but it's a similar filter, but the sound has dramatically changed. And the recordings were done at different intervals. This was done at midnight. And the plants sounded very, very moody that day. And then I did another recording of the similar room, so you can hear the difference, I guess, which was made in the evening at around 6:34. And I made a small intervention at some point, and then I sort of noted how that changed. I'll just quickly shift to the next. So it's very clear, at least audibly perceptive, how different the sounds are, even though the filters that we've used or the digitized sound is very similar. So, I mean, this is so far just very few recordings that we've done to get an essence or sense of what the possibilities are with this technology and this setup and how to kind of develop it further. So this is sort of the beginnings of a new body of work, I'd say, that could develop further and see what happens with it. So this is what I did in Wiesbaden.
Then we can move to the older works and then discuss or ask questions about this one at the end.
Sure. Okay, great. So this is a body of work that I did right before this, which kind of has been extended over a period of a year, and a lot of experiments with sound and video, and again, multimedia installations emerged from it. This was also a collaboration with a sonic artist. This was a group of musicians who basically sing folk songs, and so I developed a script, basically a very loose script, because my process has usually involved a lot of writing, and from that writing emerged something that I wanted to be interpreted through sound. My obsession with sound was also because it's, for me personally, it's a very, very visceral experience. It's very immediate. And usually when people have experienced sound, they have a very immediate gut response to it. And I liked the immediacy of that aspect. So with this, with the script, I can give you a very basic overview of what the script was and how it encompasses ideas which are similar to the plants in a way, where there's aspects of science, theoretical physics, and to some extent, one could say a mix of spirituality and religion. And by religion, when I say that, I usually refer to Islam. And I was working with it as a construct, as organized religion, but at the same time, many elements from it emerged where there was a sense of spirituality. And when I say spirituality, I refer to Sufism, which is separate from Islam, but emerges from it, and it's a different way of accessing of the same sort of journey, you could say so. So this was based on an existing character whose name is Dr. Abdus Salam. That's not him. He is, in the entire show, one could not really discern his face or see his face. And so the idea was to create, like the title entails, score for a film. So I had a cinematic film in my mind with the script. Once the script was written, I realized I can't write. And we decided to kind of put that aside and kind of pick up elements from it to create an experience of being in a film almost, or like a little space where there's forensic evidence to become familiar with Dr. Abdus Salam and the other characters within this little screenplay. So Dr. Abdus Salam is a theoretical physicist. He is very famous in Pakistan because he was the first to win a Nobel Prize in 72, I think, if I have the date correct. He passed away in 1996. The reason why he's such a controversial character for us is because he belongs to a sect of Muslims which are known as the Ahmadis. And because of that, he was marginalized. He was not considered a Muslim. And in the 70s, similar time period, Ahmadis were considered illegal as Muslims. So one had to mention on their identification card that they were not a Muslim. And so a lot of people from this community fled Pakistan. So he's sort of an anti-hero in our minds still, and there's a very constricted, restrained, strange, weird relationship that we have with him, which sort of personifies or embodies the state of affairs back home, where everybody's sort of suffering through some kind of a weird identity crisis. But how I got acquainted with him was when I read his speech that he gave when he received his Nobel Prize. And he takes excerpts from the Quran. He talks about the state of affairs in physics in the 70s globally. And he also speaks of the Muslim golden era of like enlightenment and how there's been a huge gap in between where there hasn't been any scientific progress of any sort and what is the current state of affairs and how to deal with it. So he kind of put everything that I was interested in together, and I immediately responded to him as a person. So the first image that you're looking at is basically a portrait of the second character within the screenplay, which was, so I was also following something which was very space operatic, where you have, it's sort of cheesy as well, because you have the mad scientist and you have the hero, and he has a personal journey as a personal transformation. So the idea was that Dr. Abdus Salam has not actually died in 1996 because also, so it was a mix of fact and fiction. So the fact is that he died in 96. The fiction was that because his grave was desecrated, I used that as a foundation or as a basis to justify that we're not sure he's dead. And therefore he can travel from the past or from the future. And he exists in some form or the other as this kind of sort of pervasive character who represents all of these things. And the three scientists that you're looking at are basically three imams who within the Islamic order represent the most enlightened person. And so one would go to them to receive information on religion or to increase their knowledge. So they are known as the enlightened ones. And so they're shown in a very ominous light, clearly, over here. And the title for these three characters was The Oligarchy of High-Tech Imams. And we shot in an old recording studio, which is the oldest in Pakistan, hence the very analog-looking machinery as well. And this is, so this exhibition took place first in Calcutta, where my gallery is Experimenter. So this is the first instance or the first installation you would experience when you would enter the space. So the three scientists were sort of given a very corporate identity. So you see them in lab suits. They have an emblem or a logo, which was this. It's basically a crescent and a sun overlapped on top of each other. And then there was a representation of this. So the aesthetic was picking up from a lot of local iconography related to religion as well. So back home, one could identify this with a very specific Muslim order, but it wasn't referring to that. So it was developed from that sort of imagery. And then we have a portrait of one of the imams, the chief ontologist of telepathy. So we did a whole kind of dramaturgy with the emblem, the corporate sign, and so there's all these little clues and missing links which are put together. So this is your first encounter as one enters the space. And this is the oligarchy of high-tech imams, the image that you saw earlier. And this was a little desk over here, which was Dr. Abdusalam's work desk or study. And the rest of the photographs that were dispersed in the space were images, archival images of Dr. Abdusalam. So this is a better close-up, a detail of what you're seeing. So the sound piece that emerged from it was the script kind of translated very loosely and abstractly as a very open, atmospheric drama, you could say, where there was some dialogue, but mostly interspersed with very abstract sounds. So there was a sense of narrative. So this was the title of the work. There were some smaller elements around here. And so these are the photographs that were picked up. These are all sourced from newspaper clippings. And one of them has been sourced from an online archive, which belongs to the Ahmadi organization. And so Dr. Abdusalam is right here. And so in all the photographs, his face has sort of been removed, in a sense. It's a detail here. So that would be him. And that's him there. And the text that you're seeing on the walls was also excerpts that were taken from the script that worked well with the images and the objects. And then there were smaller, these were again like smaller sound recordings where I conducted an interview with someone who impersonated to be Dr. Abdusalam, and I was myself as an artist. And so these were kind of like the missing link between the show, where we spoke, where each one was divided between time travel, a conversation about time travel, about religion, and about science. And so these were very loose and kind of open conversations that anyone could sort of enter at whatever point, and they were running on a loop. This was an element of the show that referred to or hinted to a character who wasn't really fleshed out, but I wanted Dr. Abdusalam to have a love interest of some sort. So this was a little marker for that. And this is basically an EEG recording, a brain scan, which I did on myself while I read the script. And sorry, not the script, but the speech that he wrote, because I wanted the speech to exist in some form within the show. So I felt like this was, instead of having the speech written and printed and presented, I wanted it to exist in a way that was both abstract, that referred to something that was very, very scientific, but at the same time, like I feel an affinity to this the most because in a way, like this is sort of what I was trying to do with the plants as well, where you're trying to work within a space to pick up something that might not be easily articulated. And then the show traveled, and the setup was very similar. And then there was another element from this entire show that was made later, which was called Quantum Calls, where this phone would ring after a random interval, and you would hear a different recording. So it was referring to like time travel or time sort of interspersed or intermeshed in such a way that one of the recordings was that you would pick up the receiver, and when you would say hello or whatever you would say would echo back to you. So it was almost like having a conversation with oneself, but there was a bit of a time lag that could be delayed, and it changed each time you would pick up the phone. And then there was another recording which, so these were also randomized. So each time you would pick up, it would be a different recording and not in the same order. The recording was of like an on-hold tune, like a caller tune, which it's just music that's putting you on this perpetual wait for something to happen. And these are smaller elements from it. Would you like me to talk about it?
Time we have.
Mhm.
Yeah, maybe quickly.
Well, these are all also, these are all not chronologically ordered, the works. The last two were the most recent bodies of works that you saw. This is a very, very old work, but again, very close to, or at the heart of what was happening with Dr. Abdus Salam as well. This was a very open, again, do-it-yourself sort of experiment, where on one side there was an analog scale, and on the other there was a digital scale. So the analog scale was basically a weight, a weighing machine. So the audience member could stand on this, and it would give one's weight in kilograms. And based on that specific information, one would receive some kind of a saying over here on the digital scale. And what you're seeing right now is an Arabic script, which is Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, which means that I begin in the name of God. And so these were so excerpts of the Quran were translated into Urdu, and those would run on the screen every time somebody would stand on the scale. And so based on their physical weight, they would receive sort of like a fortune cookie saying, which was picked out of complete context. So it had a similar philosophy to, I would say, something like I Ching, probably is the closest analogy that I can make to it. And also the Quranic excerpts were chosen in such a way that they pertain to weight or balance in some way. So they were not completely removed, but yet very open and obtuse, so one could interpret them in whichever way possible. And alongside this was a work which was called Deo Ex Machina. Both of them have the same title, but one is part 1 and the other is part 2. So this is a plotter that's printing out on a roll of paper a text, 2 sentences, which were truth generates relations and relations generate truth. So the idea was that the lexicon, or like the actual syntax of each word and each letter in alphabet was constantly being changed and shifted. So it looked like a machinic error. So the words were being shifted back and forth, and therefore the meaning of the sentence kept changing. And so the idea was very similar to what was happening in the previous work, where something is sort of taken out of context and kind of interpreted very, very loosely. This is a series which I did, which is again related to geographical phenomena. Also a lot of archival photographs that were collected from a time period between World War I and World War II. And all of these photographs refer to the Middle East and North Africa. And each of them has an interjection in the photographs, which is some kind of strange phenomena. Like there's a floating landscape here. Again, very iconography that is specific to science fiction. Floating landscapes, ominous mountains or shadows of mountains, a rotating globe. There is a floating landscape in the background there. So these are all existing photographs that have been doctored. And then there's a sinkhole here and another sinkhole over here. Another sinkhole. So each photograph, like I'm sort of breezing through the photographs right now. So each photograph has some sort of importance in reference to geography and history, of course. And the series was called The Dubious Birth of Geography. So the idea was to kind of create a new cartography or a new world map of some sort. But again, it was restricted not to an illustration of the world map, but to one's imagination and to actualize like how time and space could have been displaced within that period through photographs. But it was also a play with fact and fiction because these were all existing archival photographs. And so these were displayed like salon style with frames, and one could access them like this. I will skip this work because it might take a while to explain it. But we could, if anybody's interested, I would be happy to talk about it. This is, like I'm sort of jumping back and forth, but this is, again, a continuation of Dr. Abdus Salam's series, where these were called Telegrams from the Future. And each of these was made from scratch. So this is actual paper with handwriting, stamps. And they all referred to Dr. Abdusalam repeating a phrase, which is not saying a word for 82 years, before the conjunction of Venus and Mars is one of the most effective ways to send people to the stars. And all of these were postmarked after his death, which was 1996. So the stamps were also chosen from a very specific time period, and the aesthetic and the look of the paper, the feel, was also referring to that sort of nostalgic element of the 70s and 60s, which you got a sense from within the show images that you saw as well. And so this is how the work was displayed. Then we had a radiogram, a postcard. Again, another postcard referring to an old hotel in Karachi. And this was from the same series, but a separate work, which is the only existing archival image of a comet that, which is called Comet Bennett, which was detected against Humayun's tomb in New Delhi. So this was printed on an annealed copper sheet, so that's why you see like the spectrum over here. And it was displayed in such a way where usually back at home, like images like these are displayed on a mantelpiece as decoration pieces. So that was the aesthetic for it. I will skip some of these. I had initially started working a lot with photography and kind of collating and collecting images and kind of creating montages, which sort of became like the base or sketches for a lot of the later installations, most of which you just saw. So again, this is a similar technique where the images are being doctored. And these works, I did a series which was related to, again, Islamic iconography, the Holy Kaaba, and hence you're seeing a cube that is being constantly repeated here. And this sort of culminated in an installation which was a reproduction of the Kaaba, but the scale that you see is similar to the one that was earlier. It's an LED scale. It's got ones and zeros that kind of move around in a similar fashion as Muslims do when they're kind of praying around the Kaaba. And this is all binary code. But the code itself did not make any sense, so it was completely randomized. And it appeared as if it was floating or levitating above the ground. And there were some lights on top which would blink after every interval. So it almost became some kind of unidentified flying object, which was then re-shown without the scale as well. And this had a sound in it, which was like a low, very bass rumbling hum. So I would, again, like this was coming, like again, and a good analogy or one that has always stayed with me was Stanley Kubrick's Monolith. And then this is also from the series where I did the telegrams from the future, and it was referring to also like the phenomenon of magnetics and electroweak and gravity and all of these elements that exist within the realm of theoretical physics and have now, since the discovery of the Higgs boson particle, opened up a whole new world of quantum physics for us. So this stone that you're seeing that was actually floating above this plinth is actually a reference to an image that became very popular sometime on the internet of a stone that was found floating above the ground near the Dome of Rock in Jerusalem. And a lot of people thought that that image was true, that it actually did float. But in fact, it was a photoshopped image. And so I kind of liked that narrative of pushing and changing and doctoring ideas or certain images to enhance certain mystical ideas or also to kind of perpetuate a sense of superstition. So it sort of overlaid all of these ideas of faith, religion, and also science in a very, very basic, do-it-yourself sort of way. But what I've enjoyed with working with very, very sensitive religious iconography is to work with it with a sense of levity. With some humor. It's a little tongue-in-cheek, which can be very offensive for some people as well. But I think that sense of levity was also something that I had at the back of my mind, hence the floating cube and the floating stone and then the floating landscapes in the Do Whispered series. And this was a work that I did in Japan, which culminated from the series with Dr. Abdusalam. Because once we made the sound piece, there was something that came out of that process, which was really, really exciting. When we initially started the sound piece, we had an idea to develop a sound piece that was based on different calls to prayer. So each mosque has a different kind of call to prayer, like there's a different intonation or there's a different way of saying it, which represents usually because it's a different neighborhood. So the person who is giving the call to prayer is either calling to a specific sect of the neighborhood or Muslims, also the way they say it. So those differences, we wanted to kind of record each of them and overlay them on top to create like an overall sound piece. And in that process, we kind of really watered it down to a very minimal sort of gesture, which was we had like a who, which was like a who, and it kind of was laid out, like there were different overtones of it. So it was sung in harmony, basically, and it had this sort of very, unfortunately, I don't have a sound of it, which would have made a lot more sense. It had a sense of being very esoteric. It had references to Sufism, because the word hu refers to Allahu, and so when one chants that word constantly, it becomes sort of like a single monotone hu. And so that sound had like this kind of elliptical feel, and we wanted to work with it. And so that sound was then transported into what looks like a big, massive Sputnik that had fallen into the space of this museum. And so the audience could duck their head into this little opening. And there was 7 speakers that were placed inside elliptically again. So each speaker would emit the who, and so you would hear the who sort of move physically in that space in a similar fashion. So these are just some quick images of the installation, and so that would give you a sense of how people interacted with it. So this was displayed in Japan, and then I did another version of it recently in Dubai. This was called Deep Sky Object, and this was called a Deep Earth Object. So this was then a similar kind of, but the idea was that I wanted to map the deep sky object or deep earth object on different locations, geographical locations. So one has been shown in Japan, and this was in the UAE. And so it sort of continues to be spotted around the globe in a way, almost like a UFO spotting. And so this one was immersed into the ground. And at the moment, what's happening with it is that it has now been removed from the space and has been sort of buried underground. And so there's a little plaque, which is right now at the moment being constructed and placed as sort of a memorial for this deep earth object that was found at so-and-so time. So the idea was to also create a fictitious narrative which works in reverse, but what one is left with is just a marking or a remembering of something that was once there that seemed very foreign in that space. And this was accompanied by a publication called UFO Hunters. So these were a lot of images of scrapyards, places that I visited in the UAE during the process of making the work. And there was a narrative that was separate from the actual deep earth object. Yes, that would be the last work.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, first I would like to ask you one question, and then, or maybe 2, and then the audience can also ask you questions to your work.
Sure.
Okay, so by going through these images, I had to think of our exhibition, which will open next week, which is called Problem of God, and it deals with the presence of Christian iconography in the contemporary art. And we might think that this topic was forgotten for a while, but religion is somehow reoccurring in contemporary art again. And in your work, with a very ironic and sometimes theatrical approach, Islam and Sufism gets shown, or we can talk about it. And as I know, music and sound harmonics is one topic which is part of Sufi, but in the mainstream Islam it's not okay, or it's not tolerated somehow. And I've also read somewhere, maybe on Wikipedia, that the Sufi spirituality is an aspect of Muslim that in last century and the first Orientalists, so the Christians were somehow able to relate to it, to this mysticism. while other parts of the Islam were more difficult to digest for them. But still, we don't know almost anything about Sufi, and if you could very shortly summarize what we should know about Sufi and why your specific interest goes in this direction of the Muslim religion.
It's mostly for very, very personal reasons as well, because I tend not to follow Islam as an organized religion with certain rituals that come with it, and it's something that I practice myself, or at least attempt to. So there are certain ideas which have a lot of resonance to me, and one of them is coming from sound. And sound is used in the sense of lyricism or melody, more so. So it's not so much a matter of instruments. It's sort of been watered down that so-and-so instruments are considered immoral, and we should not listen to these. So these are certain ideas that have become sort of associated with the fundamental version of Islam that we get to hear, like this very crass, confused version of it. But sound, it's even within the Quran itself, like the way one reads the Quran, there is a rhythm or a melody. So it is also very much about natural sounds. It's how one speaks, their intonation, speaking from the belly, and that creates resonance in the body or from the mouth. And these are ideas that have existed in sound since man has been working with sound. So resonance is a very basic aspect. We have resonance in speakers, in like hollow objects, in this space. And so there is already some kind of spillover between both of these realms. And so for me, like I've always enjoyed kind of mixing and matching and finding those overlaps, and they've resonated with me. And so that's how I started working with sound. And elements of Sufism have existed vicariously through sound, I think, as well. The element of organized religion was also my introduction to religion, and it was also the work emerged during very, very turbulent times as well. So the first piece that you saw, which was the Holy Kaaba that's floating, was in 2008. And this is when like the situation was quite bad back at home. It was very sensitive to be working with such imagery and content, but it was also, it felt very, very important to talk about those things in that space and in that time as well. So that's sort of how I started, and then that imagery and ideas and concepts shifted, and I sort of had a much more intimate relationship with it. So it went past the topical to something that was sort of coming from within as opposed from outside. And so the narratives also became much more personal as well.
Okay, thank you. I have another question that once you said, or like an influential theoretical and artist, or let's name Jalal Tawfiq once said about your work that it would be more rigorous if you would concentrate like either on science or on spirituality. And if you just had a look on the images, like these supposedly opposite ideas like science and religion, mysticism and computers, facts and fictions, and future and history are always simultaneously present. And
well, in his defense, I would like to say, because it was a very helpful, but at the time a very confusing response for me, because I was very clear in my head that I'm not interested in either discipline. I'm interested in something that is between the two. So there's a lot of variables. So that could mean something very esoteric, something that is intangible, something that cannot be articulated or quantified, basically. But at the same time, I think from what I understood was also that if one is to work with two disciplines that are always acknowledged, and to create or understand the space between them would mean to be rigorous with each discipline first, to really be faithful to science and do things the way science does them, to have that data, and to really be faithful to the religious aspect and really understand that strain of information, and then one can really start scratching the surface, and then the connections between the two start emerging, and one could work with them. And I think for me the best way of understanding that was when I was working with the plants, because when we started working, I realized that there's so much that I don't know, and it would be very useful to know all of this. One was to acquaint ourselves with the plants, to understand them from a botanical perspective, to understand how to take care of them as a person, that is associating oneself with, but also to understand the science behind what we were doing. And that led to many more questions and many ways of working, and a lot of technical aspects, but also aspects of sharing technology or sharing experiences and it being very, very open. And that whatever we heard from the first time we plugged the tree and heard a pattern, and then we held one clip ourselves, So there's energy being generated in us, and so our voltage or pattern was affecting the trees. And so you would hear a perceptible difference. And I think it was that moment for us where we were not able to explain what was going on, even though it was very, very obvious what it was. And it was that relationship of how these two kind of coexist or don't, and how they can be amplified. Because the idea was that we're not going to create something new out of this, but we're simply just putting a mic to them and saying, speak. But at the same time, we're also trying to anthropomorphize them, no matter how much we say like we're very objective as researchers and scientists. And so we took kind of, I would say, artistic license here and said, we're artists, and so we're not scientists, and we're also not experts on plants. So let's have fun and see what comes out of that, and then we can start to kind of be more rigorous, I guess.
Okay. You are obviously a science fiction fan, and future is like very present in your work. At the beginning, I just said that you really like the topic or the motto of this evening, approaching an unknown future. And recently in Beirut, you participated in exhibition Spaces Between Our Fingers. And in Warsaw, there is also this exhibition called Dust, which also deals with the greater Middle East region, with topics related to science fiction and future and outer space, futurology. And do you think, and these topics are always like a basis for social and political critique in a way, and do you think that these topics are more present in the greater Middle East art scene, or are they present, or it's just an accident that
no, of course. I mean, there's a lot of factors that have affected what the current art scene, I would say, is over there. Of course, it's the history of the region that has an obvious role to play in it. But I think the science fiction aspect is also something, like for me, what was exciting was to find out that the first instance of what could be called science fiction is actually an incident that is mentioned in the Quran, which is that the Prophet Muhammad ascended the 7 heavens, and so that is known as the night of Miraj, or the night of travel. And so there are many, many interpretations of it. And so what's happening now is that it's being reinterpreted from the perspective of science, and people say that is the first instance of time travel. And so they have tried to explain it scientifically as well. And so all of a sudden, like, you start making these connections and you realize that there's so many ways or different ways of accessing this information. For me, it's this realm that was interesting, but I guess in the Arab world or in the Middle East, this resurgence of science fiction has been more to kind of, has had a more political slant than religious, I say. And I think since that has happened, it's sort of traveled and it's sort of become like a trend and a fad as well. And now it's reached a plateau where like science fiction is being used as a motif to talk about many, many other aspects of what's happening in the region. And it is also like a very immediate response to to the generation of the 90s, for example, in Beirut. And it is also very removed and disconnected because they weren't children of the war, but at the same time they received secondhand information of that time. And I think there's something similar happening in Pakistan, where there is a young generation which is very removed from what happened between Pakistan and India's partition and that history. And so there is a sense of wanting to reconnect and work with these ideas. And I think we're all sort of, like, at least my generation, we're very, very technologically dependent. And because that sort of augmented reality just comes naturally and intuitively to us, and for me personally, like, I never really questioned the need to work with technology or science and all of these themes, because they just seem like another tool to talk about much more larger aspects, like science or religion or whatever. So when I use the term science fiction, which I prefer not to, but I realize I say science fiction every time and then I apologize for it, which is why I prefer using the term speculative fiction, because it's more open. But also in reference to ideas of futurology and the future, like, I'm very adamant on the fact that we have sort of been over-futured. Like, everything that was expected to happen in the future has occurred in a way. And so it puts the future in, like, big question marks. Like, what does that mean now? And for me personally, like, the interest is now, like, this, like, I keep going back to quantum physics is also because it just completely changes our worldview on everything. Like, time just has a very different relationship to us now all of a sudden because of it. So yeah, I think I managed to evade your question very successfully.
Yes. Is somebody in the audience who would like to ask a question to Mehreen Murtaza? Okay, meanwhile, I will ask another question. But then it will be open again. So you just mentioned internet, and last year or 2 years ago in the Huffington Post there was an article about you which listed you among the 6 most influential, or on the 6th post-internet artist one should watch or take care of. And this post-internet art term is like a very trendy present term in the art world. And can you somehow relate to this, or you think that your work goes in a different direction? Still, it takes internet as a given fact, since we are conscious.
We're not in a post-internet area as well. But the term itself has changed its meaning and context historically as well. It's also a very dated term now. So I kind of like the fact, because everything is now time-stamped. So to say post-internet means like anybody and everybody right now is a post-internet artist. So I was really comfortable with that kind of association with the term. But it was also in relationship to the fact that I've been working with digital techniques, because I've been working mostly with technology or using it as a theme. So for me, like, that definition enough for post-internet made sense. But I mean, the term internet as like a global brain, or like this kind of network of brains from all over the world, is interesting, because I have been interested in biocomputing as well, which is also this idea where it's not just referencing the brain as such, as part of the entire body, but also many other parts of the body need to be connected. And we're also in an era where the technification of everything is so much more, like, there's a more obsessive association with that, and everything else is sort of removed or sidelined. Like, even like news clippings or articles that we read now have to have some kind of scientific basis for us to really believe in them. So what I liked about biocomputing is also this idea of just connecting the earth and plugging everything around us into it to create a more wholer brain. Whereas I feel like the internet is a very crude version of a possibility that could be a lot more exciting. So also, like, the post-internet term, I'm very, very ambiguous about, but I'm comfortable because it refers to anything and everything in a way. So my associations with it are completely different.
Okay, thanks. Questions? Okay, but I have one more, and then we can also. At the beginning, I mean, I just told you about our project, Museum Global, and you also said that the generation of the modernist artists in Pakistan have been not forgotten, but somehow their work has not been historically evaluated, and it's just happening now, and that your generation is somehow relating to them in a way. And could you say like a few words about that, like your perspective towards them, and what they did, or something which could be interesting for our project as well?
What's happening right now is we have the Asia Art Archive, and someone who has been very interested in Pakistani art history is working there, and he's been trying to collect information regarding like private collections, artists from the 70s and the 60s, which that area specifically is focused on as modernist art in Pakistan. So there is a lot of Western influence, but the vernacular or language that was used back then for painting is also a very local vernacular, which is something that has not been researched enough on, or nobody has published or written any articles on it. The problem right now in Pakistan is that there are no museums. There are no proper galleries as such. Like, the infrastructure doesn't really exist. And for my generation, this was a problem, because when you go to art school, you see Western art history and also reproductions of Western art historical objects, and so they're very flat. And when you actually go to the museum, you're like, oh, this is not how I imagine art to be. And so in a way, it just completely changes your perspective on the way you're taught art, you perceive it, and how you end up reproducing it. And because we were sort of, so you read art history up till, say, the Renaissance, and then there are like these strange, I would say, hybrids of that and what's happening locally around us. And there's a huge gap in between where one doesn't know what's happening historically. And for us, it was just really a necessity or a curiosity to anchor ourselves within that art historical timeline and really understand what happened, so that we're able to map it and say, like, this is a separate art historical narrative, and the Western art historical narrative is separate, but there's always been an overlap of some sort. And it would help us and encourage younger contemporary artists to focus more on, rather than creating a style or a way of representing themselves as an artist, but to really focus on the content in a way that seems less removed from our kind of natural setting back home. But that's also resulted in like really interesting plays between what is now considered as contemporary Western art and what's happening there, because there are certain expectations as well, like the work must be about terrorism or it must be about, I don't know, the Taliban. And so in order to evade those and really to deal with those questions, one had to go back in time as well and see what was happening historically. This has also been because there's been a huge interest in Pakistani art in the last few years. A lot of collectors from outside have come in, swooped in, and picked up work. And they've been sort of anomalies that exist as names, and we don't really know what's happening. So it's a very amorphous mind map of some sort where we don't know our own art history. And so that was one of the main incentives for why we wanted to just start collecting data and understand where the seeping between different artists who traveled, who made work abroad and came back with it and affected an entire new generation when they came back to teach. Like that entire area is really interesting for us because that a similar pattern is now emerging with the newer generations. So that was pretty much the intention.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I can leave the tree sounds on.
Okay.